Interview with Roger Powell at Woodstock, New York, November 19th, 1976. Roger, how long have you been synthesizing?
I first approached a synthesizer in 1970, early of that year. So I guess you could say since January or February of 1970.
In most of your early work, you were a studio performer, primarily, a composer,
Right.
using the synthesizer not on stage but as a composer's tool. And now, as a member of the Todd Rundgren Utopia, how do you feel that your role has changed?
Well, I think that there are two distinct roles. I think you can approach the synthesizer as a composer and use it with tape recorders to realize pieces that you've conceptualized in your head, with the emphasis being on the composition and the arrangement and sort of the background work that goes into a piece of music being documented or recorded. And then I think that there's a totally complementary uh, point of view which can be assumed, which is that of the performer on the synthesizer. Obviously, the problems involved are going to be entirely different. In a studio, presumably, if you have your own studio or you have access to a studio, you're going to have a lot of time to really tune the sounds up the way you want, to really get your trip together, and to get the sounds on tape the way you really hear them. In a live performance, you're going to be limited to a certain extent by the hardware, or you can also find a certain immediacy and spontaneous quality to what you're doing, which will just override the fact that you don't have an infinite amount of time and an infinite amount of synthesizers to perform with. You'll focus on the instruments that you do have, and more often than not, you get caught up in the excitement of the audience and you're able to project these more spontaneous, immediate feelings that you have. I think that the synthesizers that we now have available do provide a great avenue of spontaneous performance expression. Such things as pitch benders, the sequencers, this type of thing. It's a new avenue of expression which keyboard players haven't had. And I think this is why synthesizers are becoming so popular as performance instruments, and why we do see so many young keyboard players and musicians who may not have turned to keyboards are now using these instruments in live performance because of their expressive quality.
Well, it's pretty sure that, say, 5 or 6 years ago, there really weren't that many headliner keyboard stars, and now we have a great number of them. Do you attribute that to synthesis? Is that the synthesizer's role to make a star out of the keyboard player?
I think that may be a byproduct out of it. I think that it's just, the whole advent of consumer electronics, of people getting more and more involved in their hi-fi systems, growing awareness of what your personal taste really is in sound, and how you can achieve it, whether you're just a listener or a performer. Uh, I think this has opened up an entirely new field of expression for people, and I think that keyboard players tend to be the beneficiaries of this at this point. It may just be some karmic fate that they've had for a long time coming, but they, for whatever reason, I'm sure there are a lot of reasons. I think that synthesizers are only part of the whole technology boom that we're going through at this point, and I feel very fortunate to be living in this period.
It's interesting. When you first came with the Todd Rundgren Utopia, you were one of three keyboard players, and you have now more or less inherited the sole keyboard position. Has that placed increased pressure on you to produce, and what kind of equipment is necessary because of it?
Well, I had, prior to joining this group, as you said, I had spent most of my time in the studio, and that was basically my experience, was me working alone with a multi-track tape recorder, more or less as a composer. The performing end of it obviously coming in to play when I had to perform each track, but the emphasis being on composition. So when I joined the group, I had to begin to think in terms of a group consciousness, which is one level that you have to go through. And then when the other two keyboard players left, suddenly my little bubble of just being the synthesizer player and just being able to get by making synthesizer type sounds was that idea ran into the reality factor that I had to also play these other keyboard roles, which I was able to do, but I wasn't sure of at first. I was able to do it because did have a number of years of classical piano training, but I had oriented my head towards just the synthesizer business exclusively, and I feel that having to assume some of these more traditional keyboard roles did put me in touch a little more with the kind of music that people are making these days. It also expanded my horizons for what I wanted to do with the synthesizer then, because I then had this another perspective on the whole thing. So in terms of equipment, obviously the equipment had to change. When I first joined the group, I was using a custom system that Bob Moog and I had designed and put together, basically founded on the System 55 configuration, two of those types of cabinets with a custom keyboard controller. For a long time, this was my main instrument, and it was enough, quite enough, for me to have to handle this in each performance. And suddenly, in addition to this, I had to handle like 6 other keyboards, the usual array of string keyboard instruments and electric pianos and so forth. So it definitely demanding is the word, but in fact, after a couple of tours, it really didn't feel that out of place anymore, and I began to feel actually more whole as a keyboard player and more in touch with the roots that I had come through as a child studying piano, and obviously thinking about when I was a child, thinking about a concert piano career or playing classical organ or something, rather than just the composer with the synthesizer in the studio idea.
When you're using your System 55, you say you have a custom keyboard controller. What's special about it, and why do you have to have a custom one?
Well, I have to tell you, first of all, before I describe how it works, that it's no longer in my possession. It was relieved. I was relieved of it in Cleveland, Ohio, uh, during a concert stay there. Someone decided that they wanted it, I guess, a whole lot, so they took it away from me. But this keyboard was it was basically as in any synthesizer, you have to have some sort of control mechanism, whether it's a ribbon controller or a sequencer or a keyboard. This was a 2 manual keyboard array, which basically became the control center of these 2 big System 55 cabinets that I had. And it wasn't actually polyphonic, but it wasn't really the way I had the system oriented anyway. I had the system set up so that it would produce 3 or 4 voices, with each voice being a totally different kind of sound. For instance, I would use the upper keyboard in a 2-voice mode to get certain lead types of sounds, similar to sort of fuzz guitar types of sounds or clavinet types of sounds. And the lower keyboard would actually be used only to transpose sequences into different keys, and that would be another voice. And then the third voice was controlled by a ribbon controller, which sat very neatly atop these 2 keyboard manuals, and that would control the spacier types of effects, this type of thing. And naturally, I had built into the 2-voice keyboard and the monophonic keyboard beneath it, the pitch bend and modulation wheels that very much like what you see on a Mini Moog. I still feel that for me those are the most humanized controls that I've found yet on synthesizers. I happen to favor those a lot, and I still have a lot of fun with those, and I'm still learning things on how to use those 2 things. So I had those built in there, as well as a mixer and a few other control features, which allowed me to move around a little faster on the 2 big cabinets.
Do you think that there's a natural problem or a antithesis between technology and music, as some people assert? In other words, some people just will not accept electric instruments. There seems to be sort of an argument of acoustic versus electric.
Yes, I mean, there is the argument. I admit that there is this argument. I think, you find Keith Jarrett on one end, who is brilliant as a concert pianist and who simply has no use at all for electric instruments. Although he had quite a long stint with Miles Davis and some other people where he did explore the uses of these instruments, he eventually tuned back into the acoustic piano. And then you have other people such as Jan Hammer who openly embrace the advent of electronics. So I think that perhaps the argument exists, but I don't really feel that there is really an argument about it. I think that any way that you can use to produce a sound is going to be a valid way of producing that sound. It's going to be in the hands of the artist, of the musical craftsman, to bring that sound into an emotional range that is acceptable by people. And I think that we see acoustic instruments and electric instruments existing side by side in a number of situations. I personally find myself going back and forth, having studied classical piano for so long. I still appreciate that very much, and I have to have a piano around. But at the same time, I doubt that I could really make a decision if somebody said, you're going to be stranded on an island. What do you want, a synthesizer
Yeah.
or a piano? I would just say, well, neither. Because I don't know if I could accept one without the other. They're different forms of expression, different tools that you use really to accomplish the same job.
How much technology must a musician know to really adequately play a synthesizer? Are there different levels? What does it mean? How much technology should a musician be forced to know?
Well, it's how much technology is he forced to know to play a piano?
Not a lot.
Well, no, that's a question of what you call technology. A lot of people tend to think that technology is whatever is the latest scientifically promoted development that has come along. They think, okay, we must have the most technological energy, so we must have nuclear power plants. But at the same time, what is more technological than a windmill?
I see your point. On the other hand, one needn't understand Christofori's escapement mechanism on the piano to play it, but to at least get a sound out of a synthesizer, at least a rudimentary understanding of the basic building blocks must be had. How far do you think it has to go? And is it worthwhile to pursue a great distance?
I think it's just a question of your motivation to find out, about your craft. It's a lot. Again, it's just as you say, a lot of people don't need to know that much about what they're doing because they have this intuitive feel for what they're doing, which will override any knowledge that they may be consciously or unconsciously seeking about it. It's one thing to know the circuit design of a VCO in a synthesizer, and it's another thing just to know that when you move that knob, it changes the pitch. And this is really the learning technique that goes into the instrument. I think it's sort of a question of language. Is what do you call this? Are you going to call it specifically what it is, or are you going to call it what it really means to you musically? I think I personally feel that you're not going to hurt yourself to learn more about the technology of the instrument you're playing, whether it's the piano or the synthesizer. Obviously, a great deal can be gained from learning about harmonics and acoustics and just physical qualities of wood if you're into pianos.
Right.
Then you'll know what your soundboard is going to give
Right.
you and what tension you need. And
It's actually not accurate to say that all players don't understand, or I didn't mean to say that all players don't understand the action. As a matter of fact, I'm sure many pianists who voice the action of their piano or set the action for a certain depth or something have a profound understanding of what they're doing. So I guess it's a question of, as you say, how far you want to go into it.
that's it. It's if you're into the thing to a degree where you feel you need to get, this much more involved, or you need to learn constantly some other aspect of what you're doing, then eventually you're going to run up against these things. You're going to say, okay, I've learned all about technique. I've learned about harmony and scales and arpeggios, and I've studied classical scores. You may have learned this part of the technology about music. And then you say, okay, now I've got the thing at the other end. I've got this instrument, what can I learn about this thing that will help me be more expressive on it and get out of it what it is I'm hearing in my head before I play it.
Speaking of training, you alluded to the fact that you've had classical piano training. I also hear, when I hear you're playing, that you must have had some sort of an experience with a monophonic instrument, perhaps an acoustic instrument. Is that the case?
You're reading my poem. I in fact, studied trumpet for a while. I played trumpet in the high school band and went through the usual rigmarole of involvement with an instrument in a high school band situation. But I did learn quite a bit from that. In fact, as I recall it now, I have memories of that really influencing my ideas about what I wanted to get out of electronic music.
Is there a more natural bridge between orchestral instruments and the synthesizer than keyboard instruments and the synthesizer?
Definitely so. I've said this before, and I think it's been expressed, but it always bears repeating. The synthesizer, was a very arbitrary decision for the synthesizer manufacturers to give it a standard keyboard. It's misleading to a certain extent because it doesn't operate the way traditional keyboards operate, and it was arbitrary simply because it was a very convenient way of just keying notes. A keyboard happens to be an excellent array of switches, a very nice logical array of switches which can produce a diatonic scale. And the chromatic and diatonic scales are still very much in vogue these days. So a 12-tone keyboard system worked out very nicely. It could have been a number of other things. You could have had 12 sized rubber ducks, or whatever, anything else, whatever you want, you could have. But a keyboard was also a marketing consideration. I think there were a number of people who already knew what a keyboard was. But I do see more of an analogy between monophonic acoustic orchestral types of instruments and the synthesizer, at least in the form that we're seeing synthesizers at this point. In a monophonic acoustic instrument, you're more or less concerned with a melodic line, a single note at a time, and you're concerned with the musical inflections that you can impart to this musical phrase via what you can shake on this instrument, or how you can change your air pressure going into it, or how you're moving your fingers on the bow to produce a vibrato. I think that's the focus of an instrument like that, whereas I think a keyboard is a more digital type of device. You only have certain options at your command. You can pick out certain combinations of notes, but you can't really change their basic quality that much. You can't change the expressiveness of each individual notes. You sacrifice that more or less for the ability to play a lot of them at once.
Will the same be true for polyphonic synthesizers?
Not necessarily. Because when we have a polyphonic synthesizer, we have the concept of being able to have polyphony and yet combine the inflection aspects of a synthesizer, which I'm speaking specifically about pitch bending and vibrato and other expressive inflection qualities that you would have. So conceivably, you would have an instrument where your right hand could play as many notes as your fingers could push down at once, and your left hand would be responsible for the expressive qualities of it. In fact, one of the things that became obvious to me when I became involved in synthesizers was the very flexible nature of the instrument. Once you understand a few of the basics, you notice that there's a modular concept involved. Certain modules produce certain aspects of the sound, and you can have more or less of one or the other of them. You can have many oscillators in a system and get a very robust sound because you've got very many vibrating electronic circuits, or you can have a lot of filters in a system and get more interesting tone colors that way. This then becomes an option of the person playing the instrument. You then begin to think more in terms of designing instruments. Every time you Actually, this happens with anybody who has a synthesizer. Every time you sit down at the instrument and you twiddle the knobs to get a different sound, you've really created a different instrument. Now, it's true, it still looks like the same box you have in front of you, but obviously the sound is very different. And when you work with multi-track tapes, this becomes even more apparent because you've done a different sound for every track. And for instance, Larry Fast did this with the Mini Moog on one of his, I think his first album. He used almost exclusively a Mini Moog. And you listen to it and you say, my gosh, that's one little instrument that, how did he do this? Well, it seems like magic, and true enough, technology sometimes takes on the air of magic, but you're really designing a different instrument each time you get a different sound out of it. And you can carry this to even further extremes. You can say, well, I really understand maybe, what it is I want in an instrument. Maybe I should design that instrument. And a lot of synthesizer players are beginning to think this way. They're beginning to think that what I would like is so and so. I would like an instrument, and at this point, I'm going to describe what I would like in an instrument. And
So with voltage control, you simply take the basic building blocks, you put them together with the unique interfaces and the different system strategies to create the particular kind of instrument that you want.
I think that's it. It's the emphasis, becomes the emphasis shifts not on just the basic building blocks, but it goes to this higher level of organization of the system. You begin to project how you would like this thing to actually feel, that what interface you want for this hardware. For instance, you're not stuck with a keyboard, but I happen to have keyboard technique, so I thought, why, if I'm going to design a new instrument for me, I might as well keep a keyboard because that's where my technique is. However, there are some things that I want that are totally alien to traditional keyboards. Like I want to be able to have the whole chord that I'm playing slide up or down. And I have some other considerations, being a performer of rock and roll music, and in that sort of forum where you're playing in front of large audiences, you need to be visible in a situation like that. And there's a tendency these days for keyboard players to stack up a lot of instruments, which is fine for the arrangement of the tunes that they're playing, but which is not so good for them actually being noticed or seen in what they're doing. This theater aspect does become important to some people. So I envision a keyboard instrument which you will be able to walk around on the stage with, which will weigh not any more than an electric guitar or some such instrument. And this instrument will be connected via a very thin wire, or perhaps even through a telemetry system, to the actual bank of oscillators and other synthesizer modules.
So it's like a nerve center, which you can control all over the stage for a central processing section of synthesizer type equipment.
Right. There's no need to actually have to have the sound generating mechanisms right, connected to your body or right next to you in a big bank. When we do have the technology to provide a player with, as you say, an interface, or I call it an axe. It's like a synthesizer player has his synthesizer, that's his axe, and that's an axe is your instrument that you have this physical relationship as well as this intellectual relationship with. It becomes more of an axe the more physical you can get with it. And this is a thing that I think has turned musicians on throughout the history of music, is the fact that there are these variety of expressive mechanical means that they have at their disposal for doing things. There are different ways of doing things, and electronically, what happens when the synthesizer was first developed, there wasn't very much consideration for actually what you touched, or how it felt to you,
how the keyboard priority worked, or any of that.
Right, just any of that, kind of system overview of the thing. It was just, there was such a discovery just to have these oscillators pouring out this pure energy, that wouldn't quit. Now I think we're beginning to focus on the subtleties involved. We have learned a lot about synthesizers from acoustic instruments. Obviously, we've, from this sort of controversy that's going on, we've said, well, what about these electric instruments? What is it about them that appeals to us? And then we'll go back to the acoustic instruments and say, well, it's, we use them as models. Acoustic instruments are being used as models in a lot of computer music research at this point too.
Do you ever imitate instruments consciously? You say they're
Definitely.
models. Yeah.
Yeah, I definitely imitate instruments. I think a lot of synthesizer players go through different periods. I'm no exception. I went through certain periods where I didn't want to imitate any instruments, But the fact is that at that point you're imitating synthesizers.
Right.
So
there's a limited array of sounds that can be made, just in general, and it's some sounds are bound to be imitative, even if not consciously.
Right. Well, I think that there are archetypes for certain types of sounds, and I think that these archetypes, will blend and make, new types of archetypes. But nevertheless, they're still based on notes.
Mm-hmm.
We're still talking about notes coming out of an instrument that somebody plays. So there can only be so many things that you can change about that. And you can change all of those things on a synthesizer to a more or less limited degree. You can change the attack. You can get a percussive attack out of something. You have like an archetype of a percussion sound, which is a sharp attack, and then an archetype of a reed or a wind sound, which would have sort of a slower attack and an entirely different kind of envelope. It's possible on a synthesizer then to mix these two things together. But, you're conscious of this process when you're doing it. You say, okay, I've got this sound. It sounds sort of like this other thing. I wanted to get to this other point. Now, perhaps if we'd never heard acoustic instruments, we wouldn't think this way about it. But we've all grown up listening to this music. And in fact, you still can't escape it. I mean, if you really think about it, we're a very chauvinistic society musically, because everywhere you go, all you hear is sort of watered down classical harmonies. We're still living out that phase of music at this point. So to a certain degree, we're prejudiced by having these models. But then again, as I say, I think that they are archetypes and that they're just there. We would discover them one way or another, and we use them as models. And
we may as well not be self-conscious about it.
Yeah, because it's just music after all. I mean, after a while, you have to lose that focus, and you have to say, well, it's what is this music doing to me emotionally?
But isn't that part of the problem with so-called synthesizer albums? Like I was noticing, I heard an early tape of your soon-to-be-released album, and it didn't strike me near as compellingly as being, quote, synthesizer music. I just liked the music, it was just, but don't you think so many people seem to differentiate synthesizer music from music?
I think that's just the current fascination with these new sounds. It's natural. These sounds haven't been used. I mean, they've been around perhaps since Varese used some very early experiments with electronic types of sounds, but it hasn't been that popular on a very, on a gross media scale up until recently. And I think that it's just very natural for people, having heard acoustic instruments and what they can do for so long, to make this clear distinction. They say, look, this is new. This is a new form. Accept it for what it is. Accept it as its own form. I think that this can get carried away as well, though, for people who again try to say that there is only electronic music or there is only acoustic music.
I notice you don't do transcriptions. Any particular reason? Is it because you're a composer, essentially?
Yeah, I always felt that, like, quite egotistically, that, why should I play somebody else's music when I can't realize all that I'm dreaming up? Although I wanted to do some transcriptions, I always felt that I would have to be as meticulous about doing that as I would about my own music, and I just didn't have the time.
Yeah. Getting back to your new album, I wonder if you'd describe some of the new techniques that you used in that.
Well, it's hard for me to say what's new and just what just hasn't been done a whole lot before. I don't really know if, I mean, there may be other people who are doing what I'm doing and it may not be that new. I hesitate to give it that configuration. But for me, I've always tried to really push it, to find new techniques for using these instruments and to try to never let them fit into some pat description. And I'm not a purist. Perhaps that harks back to what we were just talking about. I don't believe that, I have to necessarily make an album which sounds just like all synthesizer sounds that you've heard before. I think that, like, the synthesizer has a capacity to produce music which is just pure music, which is doesn't say, "Hey, look at me, I'm a synthesizer making synthesizer sounds." It just is music that goes by, and you may or may not be aware of the techniques involved. For me, that's the key: is to produce music which appeals on that level to begin with, and then if somebody wants to get further into how it was made, they may be very surprised and they may really learn something out of it, which I think maybe is the opposite of the way a lot of contemporary music is going down these days. The sounds are very appealing, but the more you find out about how they're done, the less interesting they become. You just say, oh, well, that sounded like some great synthesizer thing was just a guitar, put through a hollow tube or something, but one thing that I like to do in terms of techniques is I do like to re-record synthesizer sounds through various speakers, through tubes. In fact, on one tune, I put a sound through a 8-foot sewer pipe.
For pipeline.
Yeah, for a pipeline, which is a remake of the old Ventures tune that was done many years ago. And to get a very pipe-like effect, I actually, played that particular sound through an 8-foot sewer pipe and re-recorded it coming out of the other end. And it gives a very unique sound. And at first, you say, how was that done? And then, of course, you explain to somebody and they say, oh, yeah, then they can hear it. But the same thing could have been done electronically if you wanted to use a $5,000 digital delay line. But it was just more fun to, in the middle of that session, to say, hey, let's go down and see if we can find a piece of sewer pipe. It made the experience much more interesting than just plugging it into a digital delay. So I am interested in combining some of these acoustic techniques along with the electronics. I've recorded other sounds, especially drum and percussion types of sounds. I made a deliberate attempt on this album to simulate more or less a drummer playing.
What's the name of the album? We haven't gotten to that.
Well, as of this moment, it's a bit undecided, but I'm tending towards Landmark. That's one of the tunes on the album. The first side of the album is vocal tunes, actually. I'm singing, and I'm singing atop this sort of fictitious band that I've put together with multi-tracks. And the drums have been played by sequencers controlling my System 55. I spent quite a lot of time getting those patterns correctly loaded in and getting the exact sounds that I wanted, sort of rock and roll, funky drum sounds. And a lot of people are fooled at first by it. They really think that there's a drummer there. In fact, Jan Hammer, who is a drummer himself, asked me who was the drummer playing on the tapes. He was wondering how the guy managed to play his two tom-toms, his snare and his bass drum, and two cymbals all at the same time in a couple of instances. So that was a lot of fun.
Good chops.
Definitely, this fella has good chops and an amazing sense of independence. He's able to do seemingly impossible things. That was one of the major concentrations on this album, was trying to get that drum effect. I feel that guitar types of sounds and lead guitar sounds are being best exemplified these days by people like Jan Hammer and some others. And that, to me, I like that a whole lot, and I still do that myself. I really like a good lead line. But I felt that there were some challenges in other areas which people hadn't thought about yet, and that was using sequencers and trying to actually get good drum sounds, because most of the synthesizer records that are all synthesizer records that have any kind of percussion sounds on them, the percussion sounds don't really have that much impact to my ear. And I felt that was a challenge that should be overcome. So there were some interesting techniques done there. I used one technique which is to synchronize a lot of these sounds on multi-track, you have to record a kind of a click track, which is moving along very fast, perhaps 32nd or 64th notes to the actual structure that's being built above it. And this click track then resynchronizes the sequencers for each successive track that you record. I don't think this is being done a whole lot, and I probably just put myself out of business by divulging it, but I would like to see some other people try this, and see what they come up with.